everybody, this is Matthew Pose with Pose Acoustics, and on this video I'm going to talk about a topic that I get into with people a lot, I hear a lot. It's going to sound a little self-serving. I do sell speakers at a wide range of prices, but I do have a preference for a particular one that is actually fairly expensive, and that is Perlisten. And I want to say that up front, but I really think the advice I'm giving you is accurate, and this is coming from somebody who has been reviewing products for a while now, has listened to at least hundreds of speakers, if not more. I've been into this hobby for at least 30 plus years. I've heard speakers at trade shows, I've heard speakers in my own room, over very, very wide ranges of prices, design types, and I've definitely developed my own strong opinions on this. So the focus of this video is, do expensive speakers sound better than cheap ones? And I suspect that many of you are going to say, well, of course they do. Yes, but actually I think a lot of folks are really hung up on the notion of there's got to be some dollar amount, some price point that's really very reasonable, where you're getting 80% of the performance of the best speakers money can buy. And I actually don't think that's true. And in fact, in my experience, what I've found is a number of things. One is that it's really hard, first and foremost, to quantify as a percentage sound quality. So when you say to somebody, well, this speaker has 80% of the sound of this other speaker, and therefore it's good enough. Well, good enough is very subjective. So even if we take some of the very objective ways of evaluating a speaker, and we show that a particular speaker is 80% as good as a much, much more expensive speaker that is technically much better, the notion that you're going to hear both of those and decide that the cheaper one is good enough and that the difference in sound, that last 20%, is so minor, I think is actually a stretch. I don't know that that's true. Myself, for instance, I get very hung up on certain details in sound that matter to the point that I want to spend the extra money on them. So, for instance, if a speaker can't hit reference levels, to me, nothing takes me out of a movie, or music for that matter, more than having the speaker distort and compress. If that speaker can't play loud enough for my needs in my sized room, then it's not good enough. And yet, if it's only, let's say, 3 decibels short, we might argue that's 80% of the output performance of the more expensive speaker. Well, it doesn't matter. It's not 100% and it doesn't meet my needs. And I know that if that speaker is distorting while I'm listening to it, I'm not going to like it, period. So I don't find that to be a valid argument. On top of that, what I find is that the best sounding speakers that I've ever heard, unfortunately, are very expensive. So, you know, I would say that the most impressive musical experiences I've ever had of any system in my life has probably been speakers that were in the neighborhood of $20,000 to, let's say, $200,000. I've heard some really, really high dollar systems that I thought sounded actually really good and were very impressive. And then I would actually say that the cheaper end of the best stuff I've ever heard would be something like the Perlisten S7T or some of the stuff from Revell. There's some JBL monitors I've heard that I really liked, the M2s for instance. There's various other products that I've heard from Grimani Systems. And these all were very impressive experiences, but they weren't cheap. They were $20,000, $30,000 or more. So for me, that's kind of the entry point of, we'll say, the top 1%. So what does it take to get close to that, but let's say not quite, where it really is, let's say, good enough for most people? Well, I don't find it to be substantially cheaper. Even half the price, we're talking about $10,000 to $15,000 for a pair of speakers. That's still a lot of money. I think what people are often looking for is that $500 to $1,000 per speaker, we'll say, so $1,000 to $2,000 speaker that they think is, let's say, 90% is good, or even 80% is good. I just don't find that that product exists. When you start to get into products that are in that kind of a price range, we'll say even $5,000 a pair, $2,500 each, or less, the compromises become more and more significant. The frequency response is not as flat and smooth. The output capabilities are often not as high. The bandwidth may not be as good. I mean, I know speakers, for instance, where in that kind of a price point, I can get you a perfect frequency response with perfect dispersion. But they're not going to play below 100 hertz with any sort of real output, and they're not going to be able to have anywhere near the output needed to hit something like reference levels in even a small room. So a good example of that are some of the smaller Genelec monitors. They're some of the best measuring speakers on the market, but they just cannot play loud enough to be used in those scenarios. You have to get into their much bigger monitors, which are way more expensive. And even those have output restrictions that make them difficult for sizable rooms. 5,000 cubic feet, they just aren't going to work. So you really probably have to spend a lot of money to get the best sound, which goes to that idea that I just don't think it's true that there are cheap speakers that get you most of the performance of expensive speakers, and that's where you should be spending your money. I think that you have to make a choice for yourself on how much that stuff matters. Now, obviously, for many of us, myself included, there's a price point at which I just can't afford it. It doesn't matter if I know that it sounds better and I want that, it's just not money I can spend. And that's totally fair. Then you buy something you can afford that makes sense for you. That's different than saying, though, that that product is almost as good or just as good as a more expensive product. Now, if you do have the budget and it's really more a matter of I just want to get the best value, that's where you start to run into those issues that I think you need to consider. Does that speaker really sound good enough, and do the things that it doesn't do well matter so little to you that you're willing to compromise there? All systems are in compromise. The most expensive systems in the world have compromises. That's pretty normal. So for me, there's a certain point where the smoothness, for instance, of the frequency response doesn't become as big of an issue. So there's definitely speakers that are a little bit rougher in the response where I'll listen to them and think, I can't really tell the difference between that speaker and the one that is significantly flatter. They're both flat, well, I should say smoother, smooth enough that it doesn't matter. As I said, output tends to be an issue for me. If it doesn't have the output, it's not going to work. Bandwidth is an issue to a point. If the speaker can't get down to 50 to 80 hertz, let's say, because I always tend to base manage speakers in some way, or at a bare minimum, have them overlapping with subwoofers, where subwoofers are responsible for the low frequencies. With that in mind, I don't really care if the speakers are capable of producing 20 hertz and below. What I care about, though, is can they produce enough output down low that I don't need to cross the subwoofer so high that I can tell where the bass is coming from. So that can be an issue, because that does tend to require a bigger, higher output speaker. Distortion can be an issue, actually. There are some speakers in the market that they measure very well. They actually have pretty decent output, but the distortion is actually pretty high. It's not awful, and I would say that that would be a speaker where if that was my budget, I'd probably go with it and compromise on the distortion. But if I had extra money, I'd rather the lower distortion, because speakers tend to have pretty high distortion. Some of the best stuff today is starting to get to a point where we're seeing less than 3%, in some cases less than 1% within the linear range, which is really decent. And there are some cheaper speakers in the market where under no circumstance at any level is the speaker ever under, let's say, 2 or 3%. And in some places it might even be as high as 10%, again, at like 75 decibels. That's a speaker where you could argue it's not that audible. If it's second harmonic, it probably isn't that audible. But it's audible enough that if you can get rid of it, you should. It just might cost more money to do so. The other thing would be directivity. So again, at lower budget points, you tend to see more compromises on directivity. There are some exceptions. I mentioned that there are some really small Genelec monitors that they're still not cheap, but they're cheaper. And they have really, really good directivity control. They're just a well-engineered product. They basically made compromises everywhere else. So flat, smooth response, really good directivity, not a lot of output, not a lot of bandwidth. On the other hand, there are other speakers out there. They've got the output, they've got the bandwidth, the response is even pretty smooth on axis, directivity isn't great. Well, again, there's a certain point there where I would compromise if that was my budget and say good enough. Now, again, that's different from saying I can't hear the difference between that speaker and a much better one that has better directivity. It's just saying that of all the things I'm going to compromise on, that's something that I'm comfortable compromising a little bit on for good sound. On the other hand, if the product has horrible directivity where the response changes really dramatically as we move off axis, that's going to cause sound quality problems in the room, no matter how good the on-axis response is. And so that's not something I want to compromise on. And I will say, at the really low end of the price scale, when we're talking about speakers that are like $200, $300 a piece, there's very little, if anything, on the market that has good directivity. Those speakers don't tend to sound very good. And I look at those as it makes sound, and as long as it's got relatively wide bandwidth, it might be enjoyable, but it's not high fidelity. And so again, not going to say that that's 80% or 90% as good as the best on the market. So point I'm making here is I think that these issues matter. Now, the last point I want to make is, what if you're not an audiophile? Does this stuff, should you even be concerned with it? I hear that one a lot, and I would just say audiophile is sort of a meaningless term that people use to describe who they are and to say, oh, well, they're like really into sound. In reality, anybody might care about sound quality, whether this is something they're big on or not. And so if you're buying speakers and you're putting it in, as a system in your house, you really owe it to yourself to listen to different systems at different price points, even if, in fact, I would encourage you to listen to systems that are outside of your price point, just to know what the difference is. I've had people before who they bought equipment that was kind of bottom of the barrel price-wise because they just wanted it for background music. But then it ended up being so bad that the sound was awful. They didn't enjoy listening to it. They didn't like using it for background music. And they were curious what they could get as like a next step upgrade. What they came to realize when they heard different systems was they may not be an audiophile in the sense that they don't label themselves that way, but they were in the sense that they appreciated good neutral sound. And the speakers they bought were anything but. So since they had the budget, when they started listening to other speakers, what they found was they really preferred something that was quite a bit more expensive. And that was the better option for them. I deal with this with architectural stuff quite a bit. A lot of people look at architectural as like a commodity product. Just whatever, as long as it fits and it plays sound, it's good enough. It's just for background music. A lot of architectural speakers sound awful. And it's worth it to try to figure out which ones sound at least passable or good enough. And that's, still probably going to be in the neighborhood of $500 or $600 for a pair. And then, putting that in instead of something that's just the cheapest junk you can buy. And if, you want better sound, more output, you may be looking at $3,000 or $4,000 for a pair. I mean, unfortunately, architectural speakers cost a lot more money for a given quality level than box speakers do. And so you end up spending more money. So the point of, again, I'm trying to make in this video is I think more expensive speakers do tend to sound better. I'm not saying that every dollar you spend is going to equal an extra dollar's worth of sound quality, nor am I saying that money equals quality, but what I am saying is that you can't get good sound for cheap. You can get maybe okay sound for cheap, but trying to get the best sound is going to cost more money, and getting like literally the best sound is going to cost a lot of money. That's just how it is. The materials that are needed to make good quality speakers cost a lot of money. And so you end up having to spend more to get something that good. And so if you are one of those people who are looking to invest and you're thinking, I want to get the best value and I want to get something good, what I want to reinforce is that you don't fool yourself into thinking that by spending a fairly small amount of money, you're getting something that's nearly as good as the best. And if you haven't heard it, you might want to spend some time listening to that better equipment to make sure that you are spending the right money. Because at the end of the day, being cheap can actually be expensive. A lot of folks who spend the least amount of money possible to get what they want find themselves rebuying that equipment later on to get something good enough to meet their needs. You would have been better off buying what you needed all along. And I've done this as much as anyone. I buy the wrong product to save money, only to have to rebuy it, often fairly quickly. Like, if I buy the wrong speaker and I don't like it, I don't know that I'm going to last more than 6 months or a year before I'm like, well, this was a mistake, and buy something else. And I've done this numerous times in my theaters and sound systems in my home. I've done this with headphones before. I've done it with clothing, bought a pair of jeans that were not as good as what I really wanted because I didn't want to spend $200 on a pair of jeans. And so I got the $100 ones only to find out that the $200 ones were substantially better and maybe worth it and lasted a lot longer, something like that. So, the same is true with speakers. You spend more, you tend to get more. There are definitely crazy esoteric stuff out there that is way too expensive and you're not getting the quality's worth. But I have never found, for instance, a $1,500 pair of speakers that's 90% as good as a $15,000 pair of speakers from a good brand. So again, I think expensive speakers tend to sound better than cheaper speakers. I think it's worth listening to them and making sure that you're getting the right product for yourself. And like I said, I think it's important to understand what compromises are being made in those cheaper speakers. I hope this was helpful. And again, I'll have more interesting videos like this coming up. Thanks.